16,000 Confederates, 10,500 Union troops, one general sick with fever in a wagon, dreaming of capturing St. Louis. 2 days later, 2 Confederate generals would be dead, and the entire Western theater of the Civil War would shift forever. This is Pea Ridge. March 1862. The American Civil War was barely a year old, but already the map was telling a story the Confederacy did not want to read. In the East, the war remained locked in brutal, grinding stalemate. But in the West, in the vast, contested territories beyond the Mississippi River, the Union was winning. Fort Henry had fallen, Fort Donelson had fallen, Nashville itself had fallen, along with most of Kentucky and Tennessee. The great Confederate dream of controlling the heartland of America was cracking at the seams, and nowhere was that crack more visible than in Missouri. Missouri was a border state, deeply divided, fiercely contested, and strategically critical. Whoever controlled Missouri controlled access to the Mississippi River, to the iron foundries of St. Louis, and to the western supply routes that could determine the war's outcome. For the Confederacy, losing Missouri was not just a military setback, it was an existential threat. And yet, by the final days of February 1862, that is exactly what was happening. Union forces under Brigadier General Samuel Curtis had methodically pushed the Confederate Missouri State Guard southward out of the state, mile by bloody mile, until Price's exhausted troops crossed into the mountains of northwestern Arkansas. The Confederates had been humiliated, and in Richmond, President Jefferson Davis had seen enough. Davis needed someone bold, someone who would not retreat, would not hesitate, would not give the Union a single inch of ground without making them bleed for it. He found that man in Major General Earl Van Dorn, one of the most aggressive, fearless, and dangerously ambitious officers in the Confederate Army. Van Dorn was a West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and a man who genuinely believed that audacity could substitute for almost any disadvantage. He took command of the newly created military district of the Trans-Mississippi in January 1862, and from the moment he arrived, he had one goal burning in his mind: St. Louis. Van Dorn wanted to drive northward with everything he had, smash the Union Army of the Southwest, capture St. Louis, the industrial heart of the West, and turn the entire momentum of the war in one decisive stroke. He wrote to his wife, "I must have St. Louis, then huzzah." At Fayetteville, Arkansas, Van Dorn assembled the largest Confederate force ever gathered in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. It was an army that, on paper, seemed almost unstoppable. 16,000 men in total, 8,000 Texans under Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch, 7,000 Missourians still loyal to Sterling Price, and a striking contingent of nearly 2,000 Cherokee warriors led by the flamboyant frontier soldier Brigadier General Albert Pike. It was a force drawn from 3 different cultures, 3 different fighting traditions, bound together by the belief that one great offensive could still save the Confederate cause west of the Mississippi. Standing in their way was Samuel Ryan Curtis, and Curtis was not the kind of man who frightened easily. Curtis was 57 years old, a former congressman and civil engineer from Iowa, and he looked more like a schoolteacher than a battlefield commander. But beneath that unassuming exterior was a military mind of extraordinary clarity and composure. His Army of the Southwest, roughly 10,500 men organized into 4 divisions, was smaller than Van Dorn's force, but it was better supplied, better rested, and, as the coming battle would reveal, better led. By early March 1862, Curtis had positioned his army along the high ground near Pea Ridge, a long, rugged plateau in the Boston Mountains of northwestern Arkansas. He fortified his position along Little Sugar Creek, just south of the Missouri border, and waited. He had heard rumors of Van Dorn's approach. He did not yet know the scale of what was coming, but Samuel Curtis was a man who trusted his preparations. What neither commander fully understood yet was that the Battle of Pea Ridge would not be decided by numbers or even by tactics alone. It would be decided by the decisions made in chaos and by the catastrophic price of 2 choices that Van Dorn would never be able to take back. The night of March 4, 1862 was brutal. Snow fell in dense curtains across the Boston Mountains of Arkansas, driven sideways by winds that cut through wool coats as if they weren't there. Temperatures plunged below freezing, and into that storm, 16,000 Confederate soldiers began marching north, without their supply trains. Van Dorn, in his hunger for speed, had ordered the wagons carrying food, blankets, and ammunition left far behind. His men would travel light and fast, strike before Curtis could react, and resupply from captured Union depots once St. Louis was in Confederate hands. It was the kind of gamble that looked brilliant on a map and catastrophic in the field. The soldiers who trudged through knee-deep snowdrifts that night, hungry, cold, their boots soaking through, already knew what their commanding general had not yet accepted: an army that cannot eat, cannot fight. Van Dorn himself was so ill, racked by fever, possibly the aftermath of pneumonia, that he began the march lying flat in a wagon, issuing orders through officers who relayed them down the freezing column. It was not an image that inspired confidence. The plan itself was audacious. Rather than attack Curtis head-on along Little Sugar Creek, where the Union position was fortified and waiting, Van Dorn would swing his entire army around the eastern flank of Pea Ridge, a route called the Bentonville Detour, and appear behind Curtis. With his supply line severed, his retreat blocked, and 16,000 Confederates pressing in from the north, Curtis would have no choice but to surrender or be destroyed. It was the kind of maneuver that, if it worked, would be called genius. If it failed, it would be called reckless. It almost worked. Union scouts reported the Confederate movement almost immediately. Curtis, with the quick instincts of an engineer who understood terrain, saw the danger at once. He did not panic. He reversed his entire army, turned thousands of men around in the night, and marched northward to intercept Van Dorn before the trap could close. It was a decisive response, but speed had its cost. Units were still converging, still finding their positions, when the first shots cracked through the cold morning air of March 7, 1862. The battle had begun, not where Van Dorn had planned it, and not on the terms he had expected. Van Dorn's flanking march had stretched his army dangerously thin across miles of frozen road. When he finally reached the rear of the Union position, he split his force into two separate columns. McCulloch's 8,000 Texans and the Cherokee contingent under Albert Pike would strike the Union right flank near the small settlement of Leetown. Meanwhile, Van Dorn himself would lead Price's 7,000 Missourians to the east against the Union left near Elkhorn Tavern. The plan required both columns to strike simultaneously, in coordination, like two fists closing at the same moment. That coordination would never come. At Leetown, McCulloch's column collided with Union forces in the dense frozen woodlands west of Foster's Farm. The fighting was immediate and savage, short-range musket fire through tangled underbrush, artillery shells exploding in the treetops, men stumbling over fallen logs in smoke so thick they could barely see 10 yards in any direction. The Cherokee cavalry, riding with Albert Pike, struck a Union artillery battery in a fierce mounted charge, briefly silencing the guns and sending Union cavalry fleeing in disorder. For a moment, it seemed the Confederate right was about to break through. Then Benjamin McCulloch made a decision that would haunt the Confederacy for the rest of the campaign. Rather than trust his subordinates to continue the attack, McCulloch decided to personally ride forward and reconnoiter the Union position. He left his command post and moved toward the Union lines, alone, exposed, dressed in a distinctive black velvet coat that made him impossible to miss. An Illinois sharpshooter named Peter Pelican spotted him through the trees and fired a single shot. Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch, one of the most experienced frontier commanders in the Confederate Army, fell dead from his horse. The news rippled through the Confederate right flank like a tremor. McIntosh did not hesitate. He gathered what cavalry he could and led a charge directly into the Union position. It was a brave decision. It was also a fatal one. Within minutes of McCulloch's death, McIntosh was shot from his horse as well, dead before he hit the ground. 2 generals, 2 minutes. The Confederate right flank had lost its entire command structure in the time it takes to cross a field. Colonel Louis Heber attempted to rally the leaderless Confederate brigades, pushing his infantry forward in a desperate effort to salvage the attack. His men nearly broke through the thin Union line. But in the chaos and smoke of the woodland fighting, Hebert became disoriented and walked directly into Union lines. He was captured without a single shot fired. In a span of less than 2 hours, the Confederate right flank had lost 3 commanders. The soldiers who remained, brave men who had marched 3 days through a blizzard without food, stood in the frozen Arkansas woods with no one left to lead them. At Leetown, the Confederate assault had collapsed completely. While Leetown was collapsing into leaderless chaos, 3 miles to the east, Earl Van Dorn was winning. Price's 7,000 Missourians had struck the Union left flank near Elkhorn Tavern with everything they had. The tavern itself, a 2-story whitewashed building sitting at the intersection of the Telegraph Road and the Huntsville Road, was more than just a landmark. It was a choke point. Whoever held Elkhorn Tavern controlled the main road running north into Missouri. Van Dorn understood this. The Union forces defending the eastern flank, led by Brigadier General Eugene Carr, were badly outnumbered and fighting on ground they had not fully prepared. Carr's men held on with ferocious determination, counter-attacking, falling back, counter-attacking again. But Price's Missourians pressed relentlessly forward. Artillery shells slammed into the tavern's white walls until the building itself became a ruin of splintered wood and shattered glass. The fighting rolled through the surrounding fields and woodlands in waves, each Union line bending further back under the weight of the Confederate assault. Carr was wounded twice during the fighting. He refused to leave the field both times, but no amount of individual courage could compensate for the arithmetic of the situation. By late afternoon on March 7th, Van Dorn's men had pushed the Union forces back from Elkhorn Tavern. The Confederates held the road. They held the high ground. As darkness fell across the frozen Arkansas plateau, the day's brutal calculus seemed to favor the gray. Van Dorn had reason for cautious optimism. His eastern column had achieved its objective, but the silence from Leetown told a story he had not yet fully processed. McCulloch was dead. McIntosh was dead. The entire western assault had dissolved without delivering a single decisive blow. Instead of 2 coordinated fists striking the Union Army simultaneously, Van Dorn had thrown one fist and the other had fallen limp at his side. His army was no longer a unified fighting force. It was 2 fragments, separated by miles of dark and freezing terrain, with no food, dwindling ammunition, and officers who had spent 3 days marching through a blizzard before firing a single shot. Samuel Curtis spent that night doing what he did best, thinking. He surveyed the situation with the calm, methodical clarity of an engineer assessing a damaged bridge. Yes, Van Dorn held Elkhorn Tavern. Yes, the Union left had been pushed back, but the Confederate right had been destroyed at Leetown. Van Dorn's army was exhausted, hungry, and, most critically, running out of ammunition. The supply trains that had been left behind in Fayetteville were 3 days' march away. There would be no resupply. Van Dorn's window for a decisive Confederate victory had already closed. He simply had not realized it yet. Curtis made 3 decisions that night that would determine the outcome of the battle. First, he pulled his scattered divisions together and consolidated his entire army into a single unified line facing north, toward Elkhorn Tavern, toward Van Dorn's position. He was not retreating, he was regrouping to attack. Second, he held his reserves in place, refusing the temptation to commit them prematurely the way so many Civil War commanders had done before him. When those men moved, they would move at exactly the right moment, not a minute before. Third, he ordered his artillery concentrated. Every available gun would be brought forward at first light, massed together, and used to hammer the Confederate position before a single infantryman crossed open ground. It was a textbook response, and it was about to break Earl Van Dorn's army in half. Dawn came gray and bitter cold on March 8, 1862. Van Dorn expected Curtis to do what defeated armies typically did, withdraw, consolidate, and look for a way out. Instead, the Union artillery opened fire. It began with a single battery finding the range, then a second, then a third, until the ridge above Elkhorn Tavern was alive with the concussive thunder of massed Federal guns firing in coordinated salvos. Confederate artillery tried to answer, but Van Dorn's batteries were running low on shells, the inevitable consequence of leaving the supply trains behind. One Confederate battery panicked under the storm of incoming fire and fled. Van Dorn personally ordered its commander arrested. It made no difference. The Union guns could not be silenced. Franz Sigel, commanding one of Curtis's divisions on the Union left, directed his artillery with particular brilliance. His gunners found the Confederate infantry sheltering near the base of Big Mountain and opened fire with devastating effect. The shells struck the rocky ground and created a lethal spray of stone shrapnel and wood splinters that tore through the Confederate ranks. One Union officer later described it as one of the rare moments in the entire Civil War when a preparatory artillery barrage genuinely, decisively softened an enemy position before the infantry assault. The Confederate 2nd Missouri Brigade broke and fell back from the tree line. By 9:30 in the morning, Sigel's infantry was already edging forward through the smoke. Van Dorn looked at his ammunition returns and understood what they meant. His men had fought hard for 2 days. They had marched through a blizzard without food. They had taken the tavern. They had done everything an exhausted, hungry, leaderless army could be asked to do, but the shells were nearly gone. The reserves he had counted on, reserves that depended on supply wagons now 3 days' march away, would never arrive. There was nothing left. At the moment Curtis ordered the full Union advance, nearly 10,000 Federal infantrymen surging forward across the frozen ground toward the Confederate position, Van Dorn issued the order his ambitions had never imagined him giving. Retreat. The retreat of Earl Van Dorn's Army of the West was not a clean, organized withdrawal, it was a collapse. With Union infantry pressing forward from the south and his artillery silenced, Van Dorn abandoned Elkhorn Tavern and what remained of his shattered position on Pea Ridge. His men, who had not eaten a real meal in 3 days, who had marched through a blizzard and fought 2 days of savage combat, now stumbled eastward through the frozen Arkansas backcountry, moving away from Curtis's advancing army through some of the most sparsely settled terrain in the entire Confederate states. There was no food to forage. There were almost no towns, no farms, no depots along the route Van Dorn chose. His soldiers ate whatever they could strip from the countryside, which was almost nothing. Men who had marched into battle dreaming of capturing St. Louis now trudged through the mud and ice of a defeated retreat, living off scraps. The human cost of those 2 days was staggering. The Union Army of the Southwest suffered 1,384 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. That number represents roughly 13% of every man Curtis had placed in the field. Among them, 2 division commanders had been wounded but refused to leave. Ordinary soldiers had held their lines under pressure that broke more experienced armies. They had earned their victory in the way Civil War soldiers always earned victory, yard by bloody yard, with their bodies. The Confederate losses were worse. Van Dorn reported approximately 800 killed and wounded, but that figure was almost certainly too low. Modern historians place Confederate casualties at roughly 2,000 men, or about 15% of the force engaged. But raw casualty numbers do not capture the full magnitude of what Pea Ridge cost the Confederacy. The losses in leadership were catastrophic and irreplaceable. McCulloch, one of the most experienced combat commanders in the Trans-Mississippi, was dead. McIntosh was dead. General William Slack was mortally wounded and would die within weeks. Albert Pike's Cherokee warriors, appalled by the violence and troubled by deep divisions within their own ranks, largely refused to fight again. General Price had been wounded. Colonel Heber sat in a Union prison camp. The army Van Dorn had assembled, the largest Confederate force ever gathered west of the Mississippi, had been broken in 48 hours. Curtis did not rest. He pressed south through Arkansas, pursuing Van Dorn's retreating forces and extending Union control deeper into Confederate territory. Van Dorn, for his part, was eventually pulled east entirely. At the urgent request of General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was massing Confederate forces for a desperate counterattack along the Tennessee River, Van Dorn abandoned Arkansas altogether in April 1862. He took what remained of his army across the Mississippi to Corinth, Mississippi, leaving the Trans-Mississippi without its principal fighting force, stripped bare at the moment it needed defending most. Curtis continued his campaign through Arkansas almost unopposed, eventually occupying Helena on the Mississippi River, a strategically vital position that would support Union operations for the rest of the war. Missouri was never seriously threatened by Confederate invasion again. That is the legacy of Pea Ridge, and it is larger than the battle itself. In 2 days of fighting in the frozen hills of northwestern Arkansas, Samuel Curtis had not merely defeated an army. He had permanently altered the strategic geometry of the American Civil War's Western theater. The Trans-Mississippi Confederacy, the vast territory west of the river that Confederate planners had envisioned as a reservoir of men, supplies, and political support, never recovered the military strength to threaten Union control of the Midwest. Missouri, with its railroads, its rivers, its iron foundries, and its gateway access to the entire western half of the continent, remained in Union hands for the rest of the war. Earl Van Dorn's dream, "I must have St. Louis, then Huzzah," died in the snow and mud of Benton County, Arkansas. What makes Pea Ridge remarkable is not just the outcome, but the way it was decided. Van Dorn had the numbers, he had the aggression, he had a genuinely clever flanking plan that nearly caught Curtis off guard. But he made 2 choices that could not be undone. He left his supplies behind, and he split his army in terrain that made coordination almost impossible. And when his generals died on the fields of Leetown, when the command structure of his right flank dissolved in the space of an afternoon, there was no system, no reserve of leadership capable of absorbing that shock and continuing to fight. Curtis had no such weakness. He had clarity, patience, and the kind of composed battlefield intelligence that is rarer than courage. He turned his army around in the night, he held his reserves, he massed his guns and waited for exactly the right moment to commit everything he had. He was, as one historian noted, the right man in the right place, making the right decisions, when everything that could go wrong for the other side was going wrong. Pea Ridge today is among the most well-preserved Civil War battlefields in the United States. The 4,300-acre Pea Ridge National Military Park stands in Benton County, Arkansas, the same frozen fields where McCulloch fell, where Haber walked into Union lines, where Van Dorn's grand ambitions finally ran out of ammunition and road. Visitors who walk those grounds walk through one of the quieter, less celebrated corners of a war that most people remember through the names of Gettysburg and Antietam and Chancellorsville. But the soldiers who fought here, on both sides, understood what was at stake. They fought for Missouri, they fought for the river, they fought for the West itself. And on March 8, 1862, the West was decided.